right, good people, we are back at the Fearless Summit studio, live on location at Fearless Summit 2024. And it's my utter honor to be seated next to this distinguished gentleman. Actually, wherever you are, please stand. Like, he deserves this honor. It's none other than Pastor Dr. Kyama, who has been pivotal in the Mavuno story. He was one of the initial 5 that went out with Pastor Morithi Wanjao. He planted Mavuno Church downtown, and now is an assistant professor in Yale Divinity School. It's almost like full circle moment. Dr. Kyama, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Karibu. So, you have delivered such a potent session at Fearless Summit 2024. And at the end, there was a clarion call for any nerds and any geeks and any intellectuals to sort of like know that they have what they have for a reason. And I'm curious to know, because you're known for demystifying Christianity to us. One, you say that Christianity is not a Western religion, and you have thesis upon thesis, and you have a book to just back that up. And you have history backing you up, and every single thing that you've taught us over the years. I'm just curious to know, with everything that you're teaching, how can we position ourselves as young Christian intellectuals to further propagate our religion and our spirituality in a way that makes meaningful sense, like the people that you mentioned at the like what the amazing things that they did? What's our role?
So I think as you look at the history of Christianity around the world, and especially in Africa, I like to focus on Africa because I know Africa, but I also identify with Africa, as an African. As you look at the story of Christianity, at every critical point, when the movement started, Jesus calls out the 12 and brings them together, teaches them what this whole faith is about. It is intellectuals like Matthew, Mark, and Luke who write it down. And as they write it down, it's written in a kind of commentary that we are then able to engage. And there's, of course, the Apostle Paul and some of the others who wrote the writer of Hebrews and so on, who then break this thing down and they use their mind. And then this whole thing explodes and goes all over. But then questions begin to arise with the persecution. What is this thing that we believe in? What is this thing that Jesus came and left? And you find that there are people, young people that come in. These are the Origins of the day. These are the Athanasius of the day. These are the Didymus the blind of the day, Tertullian. I couldn't name, Cyprian. There's so many of them. And they all come in mostly as young people. Young people wanting to engage their minds. Young Africans. I like the story of Augustine. I mean, every one of these people have a story. Athanasius is a powerful story of how he was mentored by a man of God, Anthony. Anthony, known as Anthony the Great. He was a person, he could read, he spoke mostly the local language, Athanasius is mentored by this older man who grew, by the way, to be like 100 and something years, and lives in the rural areas, but his piety, his religious life is such an attraction that people just go to him into the desert. And then he's also mentored by Alexander, who's an older bishop. In fact, so much so that when Alexander passed on, Athanasius became the bishop after him. So this is a young man. But I like the story of Augustine because Augustine, studies philosophy, and then he goes to Milan, and for some reason, I think his mother was there, and he goes to a church. He goes to a church in Milan, and that church still is there in Milan. Wow. He goes to a church in Milan, and someone called Pastor Ambrose, and we have a Pastor Ambrose in Kenya. Yes, someone called Pastor Ambrose, known as Saint Ambrose, preaches, and Saint Augustine says, man, this thing now makes sense in my mind. So after that encounter, Augustine gives his life to Christ. He becomes a person of faith. And of course, his mom was praying for him, and there's that story going on as well. But that intellectual encounter made a difference, and Augustine kind of changed history after that. In fact, Augustine is now known as the greatest of the European thinkers, and not just in religion, because Augustine, for example, figured out a way of telling history. He engaged the mind in matters of philosophy and gave kind of philosophy some direction. And his writings were prescribed reading for intellectuals from the 7th century onwards up to today. We're still teaching Augustine. We're still, at Yale Divinity, we have people still reading Augustine, for ethics, reading Augustine for history, reading Augustine for religion. And so, young people, and this was as a young man. Yeah. This was a young man. And so I think there's a place for young intellectuals to engage with the faith for themselves, but also for the good of society. Again, if I go back to the case of Augustine, when we're thinking about ethics and philosophy of ethics, Augustine wrestles with questions of what is good and what is the good that we must be able to enjoy as human beings. Those are big questions that are asked in every generation, and they're questions that we're asking now. What is the common good for us as Africans? What is the future? What is the trajectory for Africa today? I am convinced that the answers to those questions will not come from philosophers from outside. It will come from philosophers from within the continent. And that is not a one-generation thing. It is a multi-generational thing. So we have African philosophers and theologians. We have Kwesi Dixon. We have people like Jean-Marc Ella. We have people like Ebusi Bulaga. These are West Africans. In East Africa, we have Laurenti Magesa. We have my dad, people of that generation. And then now we have my generation, but then we need the next generation. And I'm calling out. Yes. If you're a young person and faith is important for you, your Christian faith is important for you, in our life as a continent right now, we need those people who come in and engage their faith and their minds for answers to questions of faith, yes, but also society in general.
Yeah. So there's a place for intellectuals. So if you have a brain, if you're intellectual, if you consider yourself one, there's definitely spaces for us to have constant discourse about the word, about God.
Yeah.
And it's much needed.
Yeah.
And Pastor Kyama, we are smack in the middle of something really interesting in Kenya. And many speakers at Fearless Summit 2024 alluded to the power of youth.
Yeah.
Not only do they possess agility, but they also possess numbers.
Yeah.
There's something about them and how they've just sort of like risen up and lent their voice to many issues that perhaps other generations would have been a little bit shy to do so in many ways. Where do you see you've studied history, where do you see young people coming through?
Yeah.
And what role do you think is the perfect one for them in this particular season?
Yeah.
With everything that's going on. Just before I interviewed you, I interviewed somebody else who said that if you're a student of revivals, you must know surely Kenya is currently in the middle of one. It doesn't look like one because it's an economic sort of like upheaval. Yeah. But sort of like just speak to that in ways of like, are we in the middle of a revival? What's the power of youth that we must tap into and harness? What are you seeing from where you're at?
Yeah. So some revivals are sudden. They come in and they end in like 5 years or 2 years. In the US, we had an interesting outpouring in Kentucky at Asbury Theological Seminary, where I think it was at Asbury University actually, where we had some young people that came in and there was something that was going on and it went on for days. That's one type. But there's another kind of slow burning thing that keeps going for a long time. And then when historians look back, then they see this is an ongoing revival. I think we're in the middle of something that started about 30 years ago. And, it's kind of peaking, and we are kind of now on the second iteration of young people that are getting into that because, Africa's actually become the most Christian continent by population in the space of the last 20 years. That shift happened in 20 years. And so we're in the middle of kind of a religious awakening, upheaval, revival, whatever term you want to use. And young people are in it because Africa's median age is something like 17 or 18. So Africa is mostly young. So if we talk about a church in Africa, it's mostly young people. And so there is that element that's going on and that is important for us to understand. Yeah. And so as church ministers, those of us who are a little older, I think we do need to engage ourselves with those people. Not that we're engaging young people and leaving out old people, but we're engaging the community knowing that it is mostly young. And so I think that's a mindset that will help us, because we need multiple generations. It's not just the young people doing what they're doing. They need the wisdom and the knowledge of the older people. They need some of the restraint of older people, because like the Bible says, much zeal without knowledge is not as helpful. But I think we're in the middle of a reckoning with Africa's young age and young disposition. And our politics and economics have organized themselves in a way that only older generations that kind of dole out that power. They've organized themselves in that sort of way, and we are coming to a place where people are raising those questions. Yes. And saying, what is what is in it for us, and how can we speak into that? And if you won't let us speak, we're going to speak. And when you look at Europe, when you look at what happened in Europe in the 1700s, in the 1800s, the mission movements and so on, those were happening with young people. The missionaries that came out into Africa and so on, these were 20-something-year-olds, these were 30-something, yes, there was 20-something-year-olds, 30-something-year-olds who are coming out for missions at a time when Europe was in an economic upheaval, was in political upheaval, when they're setting up their governance structures. That whole idea of the abolition of slave trade was started by young people. Young people in their 20s, in Oxford, what's called I think it's called the Clapham group. But then you also have, at the same time, they are restructuring their economics and raising questions about, okay, so how does economics happen? And so members of the Clapham sect become ministers of finance, become exchequers, and others become bishops, others become missionaries, others become revival, people. And so all of those things are happening at the same time, because these times of turmoil tend to seed new ideas. And as they seed new ideas, those ideas, if directed well, then can be able to give birth to things that change society. And that is true, of all kinds of revivals that we have seen. But I would also want to say those things happen in a context. But it is important to have people who follow through with the thinking from within the context. And again, this is a call out for the young intellectuals, and I really like what's going on in Kenya. It's happened in other places as well, where we have young people who are saying, I want to read the Constitution for myself. Yes. And I think for me, what would really be gratifying is for someone to say, I want to read this Constitution as a young Christian. As a young by age, as a young person who's a Christian, and to say, how can we activate the good life that this Constitution anticipates? People reading the finance bill and they say, I want to read this finance bill as a young person. I want to read this proposal for, it is a hospital fund, or the road levy, or all those things. I want to read those things as a young person who's engaging my mind, asking the questions, wrestling with them, saying what is best, not just for the Christian, not just for me as a Christian, but what's best for everybody. Because God is God of everybody, not just a God of the Christians, and I think those are some of the shackles we kind of need to remove from our minds and begin to have a bigger view of who God is, even as we exercise our Christianity, and so that my Christian conscience that is sharpened and strengthened then affects the entire world. Everything is positively affected around me.
I love that. I really love that. Pastor Kyama, please look into this camera and speak to folks who've never been to a Fearless Summit. Obviously, they missed your amazing session this morning. They've never been one. We are pushing for folks to come for next year's Fearless Summit. Tell them what is in for them when they come in for a Fearless Summit.
Yeah, let me think really quickly about that one. So Fearless Summit mirrors some of the things that I've seen in history. Fearless Summit is like this place where people come in, they speak different languages, they're from different cultures, they're from different backgrounds, they're from different walks of life, and they come in and they have an encounter with what it means to be a Christian in the continent of Africa. And so, without putting it at the same level as Pentecost, it is a mini Pentecost that happens every year that allows us to be kind of put into contact with what God can do in the continent. Now, you might be from a different church tradition, you might be from a different place. There's something to learn and something for you to take away out of that experience. So come. Come.
And I love what you've said about it being a mini Pentecost. How powerful is that? That can only come from Dr. Kyama. Dr. Kyama, wish you all the best as you go back to the raging colds. Yale.
Thank you.
Come back to us when it's summer.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for joining us.
Asante, thank you so much.
And that has been Dr. Kyama. And we have been live at the Yale Summit studio.